Hi there, I'm your host John Ivison. Welcome to the video. This week I am joined for a look back at the year of 2022 by my National Post columnist colleague Sabrina Maddeux and the managing partner of Rubicon Strategies, our old friend Andrew Balfour. Welcome to both of you. Festive greetings. As you can see, no expense has been spared on the Christmas backdrop, thanks to the Post. I thought we could start out with an informal award ceremony for performances good and bad over the last year, starting with the year's star performance. Sabrina, who in your opinion performed particularly well in 2022?
From a global perspective, I'm going to give the Star Award to all those standing up to authoritarian regimes around the world, whether it's the Ukrainian people, obviously surprising practically the whole world with how they fought back against Russia, or protesters that we're seeing stand up against really brutal regimes, whether it's in China or Iran. Especially the women of Iran have been so courageous, coming out in massive numbers that we haven't seen since the 1970s. And this could really present a tide of change around the world, where for a while it looked like these authoritarian regimes were gaining power, and maybe now we're seeing a turn on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Actually, mine, I was going to say, would probably be Volodymyr Zelenskyy, just for providing that kind of inspiration for Ukraine's defiance and the kind of Churchillian rhetoric, which we'll maybe come back to later. Andrew, how about you?
Well, I was going to take it up on a more domestic front, and I was going to point out that Minister Champagne has been out traveling the world, making deals happen. You know, we're potentially going into a recession. He is just non-stop deal-making guy, out trying to keep our economy going despite all of the global issues around us. And I think that he's the MVP as far as is for the Canadian economy.
Yeah, I think Frankie Bubbles, as he's affectionately known, has done a great job. It does look like we're going to get a Volkswagen electric vehicle plant. I think there might be even more in the pipeline, perhaps even Tesla, perhaps Hyundai as well. He's spending a lot of money. We're having to match subsidies from around the world, but I do think these are sort of once in a generational investments, that the return on that investment will probably pay off in the long run. I think just one other person who should be acknowledged is probably Pierre Poilievre. It kind of pains me to say this because I've been a critic of his style, but I do think that the leadership that he and his team ran for the Conservative leadership this year was pretty masterful. I think some of his rhetoric may come back to bite him in a general election when he, talking about World Economic Forum conspiracy theories and particularly the truckers' convoy. I stand with the truckers. That clip will probably be wheeled out by the Liberals in a future election campaign. But
I would imagine that ad is already made. I'm
sure it's already made. But despite the kind of Fight Club rhetoric of this kind of nihilism, rejection of institutions and authority, I do think that the campaign just wiped the floor with his opponents and left what was a divided party pretty united, because what's the point of resistance is futile, as they would say in Star Trek. Next up, the Lump of Coal Award for the worst performance of the year. Sabrina, what do you think?
That has to go to Hockey Canada, in my opinion. Not only for their initial dealing of these sexual assaults that have come out in the press, but how they responded in the hearings, where there was just no willingness to change, to acknowledge their faults, to be transparent on even like the most minimum standard of transparency. Really, they lost the faith of a nation when they were such a trusted institution for so long. They've done great damage in terms of the sport for young people. And I mean, I think they deserve everything that came their way. And I'm still skeptical if they can really reform themselves to become a functional institution that's not spreading harm throughout communities.
Good one. Andrew?
I think the lump of coal needs to go to all of the truckers. Somehow they managed to make this have 12 months of legs. It was still being covered up until recently. They're now talking about wanting to come back here again in February. I'll be out on the streets with water cannon if that happens. But they've stretched this insanity out for a year of media coverage, and they're still living this thing where they occupied a G7 capital, and they don't seem to be apologetic about it whatsoever.
Yeah. I think I would say Jagmeet Singh. I think he's taken his party down an electoral cul-de-sac. Dental coverage is coming in, but it's the Liberal Party that is now going around the country claiming the credit for it. I think they will get the credit, and the NDP is essentially propping up a government which I don't know how you can really be an effective opposition party and be as close to the Liberals as the NDP have become. We saw in the by-election in Mississauga, it wasn't a great result for the Conservatives, but it was a really, really bad result for the NDP. And I do think that is the shape of things to come. So,
yeah, I would agree with you, John. I was going to say,
go ahead,
Jagmeet was actually my honorary Cole Award, so I absolutely agree with you. I think also the way that he's ceded complete territory of the labor movement and working class economics to the Conservatives is a huge miss. Like, the NDP should be killing it right now, and instead they're in this supply and confidence agreement where they're not really even getting what they asked for. It's who knows if they'll get what they asked for ultimately, and they're in such a worse position than they should be.
Yeah, well, I haven't looked at the fundraising numbers for them lately, but I can't imagine that their coffers are flush right now. I don't think that, if we went into an election, can they even afford an election right now? So maybe that's part of the reason they keep propping it up.
That I think that has a lot to do with it for sure. The other one thing that I wanted to mention was the Liberal government's service delivery problems over the summer. At one point we were looking at passports, immigration, airport service, all an absolute disaster, and that does strike me as a sort of third-term, exhausted government where the relationship with the bureaucracy is kind of broken down. That's when you start to smell the rot a little bit, and the government seems to have pulled itself out of that to some extent, but those kind of problems don't go away, and I do think that the Liberal government is going to have to make sure in 2023 that it delivers services that its citizens expect and pay for.
I think too, though, on your comment about the public servants, is that, come April, we now know that they have to go back to work 3 days a week, which still I would find offensive for the average Canadian who's been at work and goes to work, and they're out fighting it. So, we'll see how that all works out in the new year. But
there's not much sympathy for the public service, but the public servants are not happy about it, and I can't imagine it improves the relationship with a government that relies on its public service.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is that they must have a tin ear if they're out in the press trying to get anyone to feel bad for them. I'm pretty sure the Uber driver who drove the Uber all throughout the pandemic doesn't feel bad for the public servant who worked from his kitchen for the last 2 years.
That's a fair point. Okay, let's move swiftly along. I call it the TSN turning point, but really I'm just looking to get what you feel was the pivotal moment or pivotal moments in the last year. Sabrina?
A big one, I think, was Roe v. Wade being overturned in the States. Obviously, that had massive implications for the midterm elections down there and really stopped the red wave that was expected from occurring. But I think it'll also have political implications up here. Canadians get a lot of their news from the States. They tend to think that our political parties mirror the Democrats and the Republicans in the States. So that means that the Conservatives up here have a lot more work to do to show that they're not a scary party for women and other minorities. We see already that the Conservatives have a massive gap when it comes to female support, particularly in the suburban ridings that they need to win to get a minority, let alone a majority, the next election. So that one decision in the States is going to have ripple effects across the border.
Yeah, there was a poll out, I think this week, where Pierre Poilievre's support among women was, I would have thought for any Conservative, worryingly low. I'm not sure how related those two things are, but they're probably not unrelated, right?
I would think they're pretty
Ontario
related.
numbers aren't very good either if, that is where you need to win seats.
Yeah. Andrew?
I think I'd just go back to, looking at more domestic things. And I think that the election of Pierre Poilievre as the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, he has a much better organization and team than the last several people that the Prime Minister has had to run against. And I think that if Prime Minister wants to continue being Prime Minister, that they're going to have to up their game to match this new opponent that they have. You know, it's not to suggest that you could just coast through Andrew Scheer or Aaron O'Toole, but they weren't the same type of opponent as Pierre Poilievre is and his organization.
So for me, there were two things which are not unrelated. One is the war, the invasion of Ukraine, and the second was the Inflation Reduction Act that came in from the Biden administration. I say they're not unrelated in that Canada is inside the Inflation Reduction Act when it comes to electric vehicles and critical minerals, but it's not for many other things. And this was described as a gravitational black hole by Michael Sabia, who's the Deputy Minister of Finance. We saw in the budget in the spring and again in the fiscal update in November that the government has behaved in a much more prudent fashion than it has in the past. I think it's moved back towards the centre of politics. We're starting to see more defence spending. We're starting to see concerns about competitiveness and business investment, which were, to me, completely absent for about 7 years. So this is kind of dragged the Liberal government into doing things it doesn't necessarily want to do. It would love to be still sprinkling money hither and thither on worthy social causes, but I do think that the nature of what is happening elsewhere in the world has forced the government to respond, and I think that's been fairly pivotal in our political discourse over the last year.
Instead of looking at it as negatively as you do, I would say that it's created a much more pragmatic government that is reacting to...
That's what I said, wasn't it?
No, not really.
Quote of the year. Sabrina, have you got a quote that sticks out in your memory?
I'm going to say it's Pierre Poilievre's latest catchphrase that Canada is broken. I think that sums up the year, both from a practical perspective, like we've talked about with whether it was getting a passport or getting access to healthcare, but also the overall sentiment that access to opportunity and social mobility and getting good wages or owning a home or even renting a home at a reasonable rate are all no longer attainable for vast portions of the population, and especially for younger people. And that line was so powerful that Justin Trudeau actually mirrored it in his latest speech for the Liberals caucus Christmas party. And his claim that Canada is not broken is, just patently a bit absurd. The question isn't whether it's broken, it's how we fix it. And I think that will be the conversation for the new year and certainly the next election.
Right. I think this is where Poilievre can score. I think that a lot of the conspiracy theory rhetoric is going to come back to bite him. But I do think that idea, and maybe not even so much that Canada is broken, but he used a line when he was talking about credentials recognition during the Conservative leadership, and it was opening the door to opportunity. And I think that idea of opportunity and striving, and this is the kind of language that I think can convince people that he is the guy, as opposed to some of his more wilder flights of fancy. So I think that's a good one.
Yeah, I agree. But I think too that while that worked well in the year 2022, if we don't have an election in 2023 and it's not until 2024, I think that a lot of those things, not to say they'll be fixed, but they won't be as bad as they were in 2022. And I don't know whether that same language works for them in an election campaign if it's a year and a half away.
I think opportunity is timeless, but you're right. Too much emphasis on just inflation, for example, might not work. When we had the November inflation numbers, it does look like it's plateaued and is starting to edge back a bit.
Anytime
Andrew,
to come out of inflation like we have, you've historically seen a recession. So while inflation might not be the problem, it might be employment, it might be a recession. In terms of housing, I don't have any faith that we're going to fix the housing crisis in the next 2 years.
You're right. Although I don't think employment is necessarily going to be the issue. Every forecast I've seen has suggested a shallow recession without huge job losses. So, but you're right. These are things that are not going away, even if we don't have an election for 12 months, which I personally don't think we will. Andrew, quote?
Well, just, we're already kicking at our friend, Mr. Singh, earlier. The last week in the House of Commons, when he got up and started the question period and said, "When I'm Prime Minister," and the whole House of Commons started laughing at him.
When I'm Prime Minister, I will keep my promises.
I mean, that just, you can't make that up.
And then he repeated it. He repeated it twice.
And then he repeated it. Yeah.
Hilarity, as I said at the time, honourable members, all honourable members, ho, ho, ho.
There's as much a likelihood of me being Prime Minister as him.
And there's no likelihood of that.
Exactly.
So my quote of the year, it still sticks with me, was when Zelenskyy spoke to the UK Parliament, and he just struck me as a guy who knows his audience, and he just hit the right tone, because it was a kind of blitz spirit Churchillian quote, which was, "We will not give up and we will not lose. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores and in the streets. We will continue to fight for our land, whatever the cost." And this was at a time where the fortunes were still very much in the balance, and I do think that is a very rare commodity in leaders who can come out with such inspiring words, and obviously it's had an effect in Ukraine. Closing up, predictions for the year ahead. Is there anything that? By the way, this is obviously being recorded, and I did look back at what I predicted last year, and it didn't wear very well. So, bearing that in mind, Sabrina, what do you think for next year?
A couple things, and we've touched on them a bit. One, that economic pressures are only going to increase, and that we're probably going to see some form of a recession, and that will be the number one concern of the electorate in Canada going forward. Number two, I do think that Jagmeet's performance, or lack thereof, is going to start to catch up with him more and more, and I think we might see more pressure from within his party for a possible change in leadership.
Wow. Yeah, I could see that. Andrew?
Well, I think it'll be, interesting to see what happens in the province of Alberta over the next few months leading into their election. That's going to be something to watch based on what we've seen coming out of there so far, and all sorts of craziness. But I also think that it'll be interesting to see where the economy goes. I think that we're going to do better than people expect. And I think, to your earlier point, we might see a shallow and short recession, but I don't think it's the doomsayers. I don't think have it right. I think that we're in a better position than people think we might be.
I was going to link to what I was talking about earlier, and I think that there has been a moderation of government policy to accommodate events, but we are going to be moving towards an election. They're generally every 18 months in a minority parliament, which means that we're, if not going to have one in 2023, then probably early 2024. And as a result, I do think that the Trudeau personally will start to weaponise some of the stuff that Poilievre has said, start to try and create a distinction on healthcare. I do think that healthcare is going to be a big point of differentiation. Poilievre's point is essentially this is something for the provinces. We will not starve the provinces of money, but we won't get involved. Trudeau, on the other hand, I mean, they've still got campaign promises from the 2021 election worth billions of dollars, namely on mental health and on increasing the supply of doctors and nurses. Funding directly related to these things, and I do think that we're going to see harsher rhetoric from the Liberals along the lines of what they did on vaccine mandates, where that essentially became the ballot question in 2021. As we've got voters are becoming more dogmatic, so our political leaders will pander to that dogmatism, and we're going to have a Liberal Party going left and a Conservative Party going right, and most of the rest of us will be sitting in the middle wondering what the hell just happened.
Well, I think, too, though, on the healthcare thing, and this is like a pretty simple prediction, that the divide and conquer of the premiers will be pretty simple. They're trying to take a united front right now. The second that there's a deal on offer from Ottawa to Ontario or Ottawa to insert province, the premiers aren't going to stick together. We already know that.
No. We saw that when
We've seen this movie
was
before.
Health Minister. Yeah, for sure. Okay, guys. Well, listen, that was a great discussion. I think we all chose different things, and it made it an interesting chat. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you in the new year.
Merry Christmas.
You too, John.